Good evening. My name is Terry Eichel, and I work with the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, a faith-based environmental organization in Connecticut. The first thing I would like to do today is show you how to select a language. We are very pleased to be able to offer Spanish interpretation for the first time, but this means that everyone actually needs to select a language in order to hear everything. So at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a globe with the word interpretation. There's a red arrow pointing to it. Click on that, and from there, choose your language, either English or Spanish. If in the same box, choose mute original audio. For Spanish speakers, this is obviously extremely important. I believe English is the default language, but if you don't choose it, then you won't hear Spanish questions being translated into English. So thank you so much. I will probably explain this again to catch any latecomers. Together with Hartford International University for Religion and Peace, I want to welcome you to our fourth webinar together. This one is called Climate Change and Migration, Why Do People Leave the Homes They Love? I would like to open with IREJN's Land Acknowledgement Statement. We acknowledge that Connecticut, Algonquin for land on the tidal river, is the traditional home of Mohegans, Pequots, and many other tribes. We are grateful for our Native people's care for their home and will strive to preserve it for the next 7 generations. I would like to especially thank our sponsors for this evening. This webinar is made possible through the support of supporters like Lynn and John Fulkerson and Barbara Edelstein, and we are very grateful for their support. I'm also very pleased to welcome our presenters tonight. Ali Notani is the President and CEO of the National Immigration Forum, and Tabitha is a climate and immigration activist. I'd also like to welcome our moderator, Eamon Ormsa. Thank you all for being with us tonight. After we hear from our presenters, Eamon will lead a moderated question and answer session, and then we will take questions from the audience. So please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce Susan Schoenberger from the Hartford International University for Religion and Peace.
Thank you, Terry. We are just so delighted to be hosting this event with the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network on this important topic. And as Terry said, my name is Susan Schoenberger. I'm the Director of Communications and Educational Outreach for Hartford International University, formerly Hartford Seminary. So many of you may know us by that name. If you're not familiar with us, we are a graduate school with a focus on interfaith dialogue and peace building. And we have a diverse, multi-faith faculty and student body. Please check out hartfordinternational.edu for information about our degree programs, our leadership certificates, our executive and professional training, and events like this, that most of which are free. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Terry for all her work in organizing this event, and to thank the co-founders of the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network, Reverend Tom Carr and Lynn Fulkerson, who have both been so dedicated to these programs and to saving our planet, and involved in planning these events over the past year and a half that we've been doing them. So thank you again, and thank you to our panelists tonight. And now I will turn it back to Terry.
Great, thank you so much. Just before I introduce Eamon, I want to just reiterate for anyone who's just signing on that we have Spanish interpretation available. And so for everyone, we're asking them to go to the bottom of their Zoom screen, click on the globe that says interpretation, and select a language, either English or Spanish, and then select mute original audio. This will allow you to hear everything that's being said in the language that you choose. This is our first time offering Spanish interpretation. We are very excited about it, and I hope it goes very smoothly. Now, I would like to introduce Eamon Ormseth. He is a master's student at Hartford International University, and he is our moderator tonight. He is a community organizer who has worked to combat Islamophobia in Montana, has studied Arabic and taught English in Jerusalem, and worked for a study abroad program in Morocco. He believes that working to mend the twin crises of climate change and migration requires approaching them as a spiritual crisis because people have lost their sense of connection to the earth and to each other. As a student in the Masters in International Peacebuilding program at Hartford International University, he is exploring the roles of storytelling, dialogue, mediation, and trauma healing in building peace.
Thank you, Terry. And welcome on behalf of both Hartford International University and the Interreligious Eco-Justice Network to our webinar. I'd like to welcome our first panelist, Ali Notani. Ali, are you ready? I'll just give him a brief introduction and we'll let him take it away. Ali Notani is President and Chief Executive Officer of the National Immigration Forum, a nonpartisan advocacy organization working with faith, law enforcement, and business leaders to promote the value of immigrants and immigration. Through innovative constituency, communications, and advocacy strategies, Ali is one of the nation's most creative coalition builders. Ali provides a principled and reasoned voice on immigration policy and politics at the local, national, and global level. He has appeared on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, NBC News, ABC News, PBS NewsHour, and various radio and local news programs. He has been quoted on the pages of most of the nation's major dailies and is a regular speaker at conferences and campuses across the country. So please, Ali, take it away.
Hey, thank you so much, Eamon. I really, really appreciate the opportunity. I really want to also thank Hartford International University. It's just so important and critical that this conversation is happening. And I got to say, even though we're not on a physical stage together, it's a virtual stage. It's a real honor and a pleasure to share the panel with Tabitha. She's just, I think, one of the most innovative and smartest activists out there. And I look forward to hearing what she has to say, because I always feel a little bit smarter coming out of it. So like Eamon said, I run the National Immigration Forum. We're an immigration advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C. And, what we really try to do is always build out the coalition of voters who are thinking about these issues, who are working on these issues. And I'm actually just about a month out from publishing a new book called Crossing Borders, The Reconciliation of a Nation of Immigrants. And as I was researching this book, and when you've been doing immigration policy as long as I have, you kind of think, well, you've seen it all. But as I was researching Crossing Borders, I started to find myself digging into how migration was being weaponized, and frankly, the migration narrative and the stories that are being told about migration are being weaponized for political purposes. So I started kind of following that rabbit hole, and eventually found myself learning more and more about the Syrian refugee crisis that hit the front pages around the world in 2015, but actually going back to March 15th, 2011, when the Syrian civil war first was ignited. And what I found is that war, the millions of Syrians that were displaced, the untold numbers that died as they were fleeing Syria, the crisis that continues to this day, was started because of climate change. In fact, I found that in 2011, 60% of Syria's land suffered from a catastrophic drought, which meant that tens of thousands of frightened, angry, hungry, and impoverished former farmers are streaming to Syria's towns and cities in 2011, trying to get the government to react, or even more, probably more importantly, is trying to figure out how are they going to put food on the table for their own families. And at this moment, what's also happening is that you have the Arab Spring happening across the Middle East, and you have efforts from a very grassroots level to push against authoritarians across the Middle East and try to create some sort of democracy. This began in Tunisia and kind of went across the region. Well, in Syria, on March 15th, 2011, when I'm quoting William Polk, who's a Middle East expert. He wrote, when a relatively small group gathered in the southwestern town of Daraa, a small group of farmers, to protest against the government's failures to help them, the protest led Syrian President Bashar al-Assad to put down that protest with massive force. In that moment, that crackdown on a protest because of a drought that was impoverishing farmers, a drought that I think we could all trace to the way that the globe's climate is changing, has led to such a massive outpouring of migration around the world. So, I mean, in short, climate change and food insecurity, factors that the world is going to contend with for years, if not decades to come, is what caused this crisis and what led to so many things that have happened in Europe as they have struggled with not just the Syrian refugee crisis, but at the end of last year, when the Belarusian president tried to weaponize migration to force the European Union and Poland in particular to cede concessions or cede on some sanctions they had put forward. But over and over again, migration is being weaponized, and migration that is being caused by climate change is going to make this more and more visceral at a global level. And so then, that's in some ways that feels far away, even though we all read about it and we, may very well have worked in our respective communities to welcome Syrian refugees over the years. But if you bring it home closer, and I know Tabitha is going to speak about Central American migration, so I'll leave it to her expertise, but bring it even closer, what's happening in communities across the United States. For example, in South Florida, what you see more and more is, the wealthy folks who built homes on the waterfront because of climate change, they are moving inland. And when they move inland into kind of other neighborhoods within Miami, for example, Little Haiti, they are pushing out immigrant populations that frankly have revitalized so many of these neighborhoods. So there's a level of internal migration within the United States that's being caused by climate change, and so that's something to kind of keep in mind. And the other piece of this is that oftentimes when there is that natural disaster, the one that at least I think of most often is Hurricane Katrina. New Orleans empties out as families are fleeing. But who ends up coming to New Orleans to help rebuild the city? It ends up being mostly immigrant workers, documented or undocumented. So climate change causes a migration out of New Orleans, but then a migration into New Orleans by immigrants. And then the question is, what are the occupational health protections for immigrant workers who are helping cities and communities rebuild after climate disasters? So it's another piece of this that we don't often talk about, and there's a new organization that's been started called the Resilience Force, which has really done some amazing work to advocate for workers who are on the front lines of these rebuilding efforts and ensure that they have the protections that are, because they're doing jobs that are created by, again, the catastrophes caused by climate change and the forcing or the outmigration of the communities that are there. And then, I think the one of the most important parts of this, and I want to spend a little more time on this piece, is how we talk about immigration and climate change. We were part of a recent report that we did in partnership with the Migration Policy Institute, the RAND Corporation, and the Metropolitan Group. And we looked across 5 countries and we did case studies on each country and tried to understand what was driving their respective migration narratives. How were they being weaponized? How were they being used in a constructive way? And it was interesting because we found a few different things. And keep in mind, in this case, migration narrative, when it's It's used to set a policy context. It's used to motivate people to take action. Narratives are used also to advance political goals. But what we found across these case studies is that, number one, by and large, those who are trying to create positive narratives around migration, it would tend to be kind of an elite top-down message. And the message or the narrative would often be immigrants are a net benefit to the country. It's good for the economy. It's the right thing to do. It's who we are as a nation. And there were top-down driven narratives that, by and large, we would probably all agree with to one degree or another. But the thing is that these narratives often did not acknowledge the tensions and the complications and the complexities that come with immigration. So these top-down narratives kind of ignored not just the complexities, but also the skepticism that so many people have about the efficacy of governments these days. So in this way, so those are two findings at least. And then the third one that I wanted to share is that across all these case studies, there was really no climate migration message or narrative to speak of. So it's kind of a blank slate. But as I was kind of thinking about this evening, I have come to believe that that blank slate is actually very, very dangerous. Because, look, if we're going to be honest here, the two issues that are probably most politically controversial in the United States today are climate change and immigration. And there's other issues out there by all means, but it's probably top two out of or in the top five at least, right? So if we are going to develop a way to talk about climate migration, I think we have to keep in mind these lessons of kind of a top-down narrative versus a bottom-up narrative. Because right now, those who are against addressing climate change, those who are against immigrants and immigration, they are much better at creating and tapping into the anger and the skepticism and creating bottom-up narratives that are weaponized for political gain and end up leading to not just bad immigration policy, but bad climate policy. So I think that because oftentimes we think just about the policy, right? We don't think about the stories that shape the environment, that create the conditions for the policies. So I would argue that, yes, we should be talking about how climate change is leading to the movement of people across borders, how that informs and it changes and it pressures borders. We should be talking about the need to, the full range of mitigation efforts when it comes to climate change. But I think one of the most important things that we can do is actually create some sort of a shared understanding between, for example, a farmer in the Midwest who is worried about a drought that will impact his or her farm. What's the shared experience between that farmer and then the coffee farmer in the highlands of Honduras? I've gotten to know a good friend of mine, Max Finberg, who used to work for U.S. Department of Agriculture. He now runs an organization that does exactly this. And I actually talked to him it was a couple of weeks ago, and one of the dairy farmers that he works with in upstate New York, politically very conservative, socially very conservative, but he has, through his personal learning, through his faith, through his trips to Central America to sit down with farmers, he has come to understand that he is very, there are more similarities between him and a farmer in Honduras than there are differences. In fact, the only differences are in some ways are a matter of birth and kind of what side of a border they were born on. So now when I talk to that farmer in upstate New York, he's asking us, what can I do to improve our nation's immigration policies? What can I do to ensure that countries in Central America have the resources they need to address the root causes of migration so their land is more sustainable? But it came down to that, creating that experience. So they had a shared understanding of how a life in upstate New York was surprisingly similar to a life in Central America when it comes to a farmer. And so often we have a tendency to just say to that farmer in upstate New York, you're a Republican, right? Or, you're just here for, you just want cheap labor. But we're not understanding what his or her anxiety is when it comes to making sure that they and their families are going to do better. And that anxiety, in many ways, is the same anxiety that a farmer in Central America has and leads them to make a decision to migrate. So I'm looking forward to the Q&A. And again, I just really want to thank you for this opportunity. And I'm looking forward to the dialogue.
Great. Well, thank you, Ali, for the extensive presentation, and I appreciate the many points you brought up. I had a chance to listen to your podcast today and yesterday in preparation for this, and I agree. I think that the stories that we tell about immigration and climate are going to set the terms of policy debates moving forward. So that's a great segue into our next panelist, Tabitha Sukdeo. Tabitha is a student at Yale Law School in the Department of, Terry, can you put the slide up? Oh, excuse me.
It is up.
Yeah, Tabitha Sukdeo is a formerly undocumented immigrant who was originally from Guyana in South America and grew up on St. Martin in the Dutch Caribbean. Tabitha completed her undergraduate studies in environmental justice and has been heavily involved in urban farming, migrant farm workers' rights, and refugee resettlement. She is passionate about legal remedies for environmental migrants. Tabitha is a joint degree student at the Yale School of the Environment and Vermont Law School. Welcome, Tabitha.
Thank you. Great. I'm just gonna share my screen to make sure this works. Great. Can everyone see that okay? Great. Okay, well, hi everyone. Thank you for having me this evening. And Ali, thank you so much for your kind words. Folks, the first time I met Ali was when I was 19 years old and facing some really complicated legal challenges as an undocumented immigrant. And so really happy to have you here, Ali. And thank you, Eamon, and thank you, Terry, and the Hartford International University for having me. So this slide right here, it shows the legal definition of a refugee, and it was created in the 1951 United Nations Convention. You will notice that one cannot become a refugee unless they have a well-placed fear of being persecuted for the reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. What we don't see here is environmental disasters or climate change. The reason for this is that climate change is often only one of the drivers causing forced migration. But what happens to those who are exclusively displaced by climate-induced disasters? Where do they go? When we think about environmental migration in Connecticut, you might start to think about the Puerto Rican evacuee crisis during Hurricane Maria. Now, I'm not as familiar with Hartford, so please excuse me. I can only speak about New Haven, but IRIS, which is the Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services, and Junta for Progressive Action in the city of New Haven resettled many Puerto Ricans in the city. It's devastating to lose your home and to have to leave. And unlike immigrants, Puerto Ricans are American citizens, and they're legally allowed to move between the island and the mainland. Climate change is causing more frequent and stronger hurricanes, which then can cause storm surges. And we see this effect quite drastically, but what we don't see as much is the slow onset of environmental migration. And so I'd like to tell you a little bit about my home country of Guyana. Some quick background. So Guyana is located in the northeast region of South America, and it shares borders with Venezuela and Brazil and Suriname. Approximately 90% of the population lives on the coast, which is a remnant of colonial times. The majority of inhabitants living in the interior are Amerindians, Afro-Guyanese, who were formerly enslaved Africans and who were able to escape slavery. Guyana has a fairly new government. As it gained independence from England in 1970, Guyana was originally part of the Guyanas, plural. It was first colonized by the Dutch and then split up into 3 different countries among the English, the French, and then the Dutch. The Dutch actually traded New York for Suriname during, I just wanted to give you that kind of fun fact. So I think it's really important that we talk about the colonial context, because the reason why people live on the coast is because there were former slave owners. And so that's why everyone kind of have stayed to the coast. The coast of Guyana is at sea level, and it's prone to floods at the cost of climate-induced sea level rises and storm surges. There are a couple of sea level defenses, like a really old seawall that the Dutch built, but unfortunately it is falling apart. And there's additional complex ecosystems of mangroves and trees and seagrasses. But all of these resources are unfortunately dying because residents are using them as natural resources for sources of fuel and fire and so on. The main problem I would like to focus on is stemming from the environmental migration in the villages here that you will see. So there's administrative region 1 that's called Barima Waini, and then region 4 that's called Demerara Mahaika. And this is where people have been facing displacement as their homes and farmlands have become flooded. And this is unfortunately a new normal. So this is a farmer in a village called Dansik in 2020. He's lost all of his crops for the year. And for many coastal farmers, this is their livelihood. It's how they feed their families. When salt water enters the farms, we call this saltwater intrusion. Lots of crops have failed because of this, but it is really a combination of drought and irregular weather patterns. Farms in this region are up to 6 feet below sea level. There are projections for sea level rise in Guyana for, I think it's up to 19 feet, which is quite a lot. So just so you know, for folks who are from the Northeast, saltwater intrusion is also happening in Connecticut and Long Island, but there are groups like the USDA Northeast Climate Hubs that are providing these sorts of technical assistance for farmers. So Ali, we definitely need to talk later, because I'd love to talk to you about some initiatives for agricultural solidarity with these farmers. This slide here is region 1, and mostly indigenous populations live on the coast in this region. Many villages, just like the one that you see here, has been completely deserted because the water continues to get closer and closer to the buildings. And there's a trend that I learned recently after interviewing a few of the folks in this region. They've said that indigenous Venezuelan refugees are moving to these areas, which is incredibly dangerous because these areas here, like in this picture, is prone to flooding. And so we have these indigenous Venezuelan refugees who are moving from one vulnerability to the next, a political vulnerability to an environmental one. And so I hope this starts to bring some connections in your mind that already marginalized communities are especially prone to the ramifications of climate change. Geographer Andrew Baldwin writes that environmental migrants are a form of racial other due to their nature of being in an ambiguous space between order and disorder, expressing a set of white anxieties to do with an impending loss of control and dissolution of boundaries. Environmental migrants often come from the global South and are people of color. They are placed in these precarious positions and so are doubly racialized. The irony of the situation, as many of you might know, is that the global South has caused the least amount of greenhouse gases that is perpetuating climate change, but the global South is facing the ramifications of climate change the most. Racism is deeply rooted in global migration governance, so much that it can be found essentially in all countries' policies and practices. More economically developed countries typically host countries for environmental migrants, they are the one that makes these decisions and in turn disadvantage less developed countries. And so as I do more research, it's starkly apparent that the people who are researching environmental migration, this phenomenon, they are usually white Europeans who rarely even mention race or colonialism as an operative of environmental migration. And the reason I say this is because many folks in the Caribbean and in South America, they were enslaved by the global North and brought to these regions without a choice. And so what happens when people are experiencing climate-induced migration? What happens when they are the ones who are doing the research and when they are invited and asked to be at the table to make these decisions about their lives? So I know that's kind of all sad and doom and gloom. And so I just wanted to kind of leave you with a little nugget of hope. So I'm in law school right now. I'm just a baby law student, just doing my first year, but there has been one case from January 2020 where a migrant farm worker from Kiribati had asylum seeker in New Zealand. And essentially what happened was that the United Nations made a ruling for the first time that said that countries cannot deport individuals who face climate-induced conditions that violate the right to life. And so this, within the legal world, this is very slow moving, but it is starting to happen. And these conversations are occurring within international communities and within legal communities as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tabitha, for your presentation, for showing us some of your own experiences and for connecting it also to what Ali said. And we will be now moving into the moderated question part of the webinar. So I will ask a question that both panelists will have a chance to answer. And after that, I'll ask 2 more questions. So I'm going to invite Tabitha and Ali back on the stage and ask my first question. So in recent years, increasing numbers of migrants have made the long journey from the Northern Triangle, which is a term used in the United States for the countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. These migrants have been seeking asylum at the US border. Media portrayals have focused on the role that criminal organizations in the Northern Triangle have played in driving people to leave, which is an important factor to be sure, but the role of climate change has been underappreciated. So how has climate change impacted the Northern Triangle and the choices of people from these countries to migrate to the United States?
Yeah, Ali, I didn't really talk too much about Central America, but yeah, it's interesting because it continues to talk about agriculture, or rather I should say, we can continue to talk about agriculture. Within the Northern Triangle, I think we can also talk about the dry corridor. That's kind of what we call it within the environmental community. And what has been happening over the past 5 years is that the land is no longer arable in some of these areas. And so farmers can't plant any crops, they're not viable. And so people are moving because they literally cannot plant any food. And I think that really becomes overshadowed by the violence that is unfortunately occurring in the Northern Triangle, where that becomes the point of conversation much more than climate change.
Yeah, so I would add to that. Again, when I was researching this book, I spent some time in Honduras, and I did a trip to a part of a community outside of about 2-3 hours outside of Tegucigalpa. It was called what was it called? I'm blanking. La Union, sorry. And it was in the Coffee Highlands, and we ended up driving. It was probably about, I think, 4,000 feet elevation, and we sat down with a coffee farmer named Carlos. And Carlos and his family had, been coffee farmers in this very rural part of the Honduran mountainside. It was gorgeous, right? You kind of right outside the front door of their small 2-room kind of cinder block home, you just saw these magical valleys. It's just amazing. But as we're driving up, at a certain elevation, you get past the tree line, where the trees start to thin at least, you start to see the coffee plants. And our kind of guide for the day said that year, the beans were smaller, and that was by and large due to an ongoing drought in Honduras. And, and he told us that, so then we make it up, and we're sitting down with Carlos, and he's telling us about his efforts to get to the US. And he had just returned from the US-Mexico border about 3 weeks earlier. He had been, he made this decision to go to the United States because his crop yield was diminishing. The buyers didn't have any money, so they couldn't give him a loan. The industry overall was recovering from a coffee leaf rust, not just the most recent one, but the one before that. So every single farmer that we talked to in that trip was just financially strapped. And they all said, well, if we could immigrate to the United States legally, we would do that in a heartbeat. But they have very few, if any, legal pathways to the United States. So the pressure that was building, the financial pressure that was building on them because of the way the climate was changing, which led to a financial impact on their harvest, led them to say, okay, the only thing I have is my house. So I'm going to mortgage my house, and that will give me just enough money to pay a coyote to get me from Honduras to Guatemala, then through Mexico, and then to the US-Mexico border. So these things they're wound together. And, I guess, I often say that we as a country have outsourced our immigration system to the cartels, because the cartels are the ones who are deciding who can get to the border and apply for asylum. And, and the cartels have that business because of the way that climate change is pushing people into these decisions, and the fact that our nation has failed to update its immigration system.
Yeah, thank you for that. Both of those answers. I think oftentimes, like you said, Ali, in your presentation, and Tabitha as well, the violence and some of these images in the media, they distract us, or at least make it harder to see how complex some of these causes are and how intertwined they are. And both of you actually mentioned agricultural policy, and Ali, your story about the farmer from Central America and the farmer in, I think you said upstate New York, but somewhere in the Northeast. And Tabitha, you talked about saltwater intrusion in Guyana, and it seems like you two both have some, of course, personal experience working with immigration and immigrating, and also professional experience. So for our next question, I wanted to ask, from both a policy and or community organizing standpoint, where do you see this intersection of climate and immigration justice? And this question is also for our audience to encourage them to think about ways in which they can plug into this movement for, I guess, climate and immigration justice. I don't know if you have a better term than it for me, but yeah.
Thanks, Ali. And thanks, Eamon, for that question. I think it's an important one. When I was talking earlier about the types of ways one can become a refugee, it does not include provisions about environmental degradation, natural disasters, or climate change in general. And there have been talks about how the United States might be able to provide rights to folks and allow for temporary protected status. There's been a lot of literature around that being a solution. However, that's temporary. And so my answer is always going to be that we need to have comprehensive immigration reform that considers all of these aspects. But that, unfortunately, that's been a very contentious issue. For as long as I can remember living in the United States, there's always been talk about comprehensive immigration reform, where there's been 4 Republicans and 4 Democrats that have come together and try to come up with policies, but unfortunately, nothing has been done. And so I think for what we have to do with that in our minds is to think about this global issue, but acting locally. I think that the average person can become parts of like local zoning boards, or asking your local congressional leaders about what it is that they think about climate change, and what are their plans for climate adaptation, right? I think if there's a lot of questions and a lot of inquiries from the general people, I think it forces politicians and for community leaders to start having these dialogues. And so I think the way that these two issues, I see someone put in the chat, ecological justice, I think that's really good, or environmental justice. I think we have to start asking questions even within this community of who is getting left behind. Those with more resources can leave, right? When things are happening in countries that have environmental crises, right? Who's getting left behind? Usually it's folks who are elderly, folks who are differently abled, women and children, right? And so I think one is being really aware, and then just having these conversations. Yeah, I think that's all I have for right now, but that's a really good question. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Eamon, I guess we do a lot of work with immigrants, but the full extent of my immigration journey has been from California to Washington, D.C. So no worries. I just, I'm very, very lucky and fortunate to work with a lot of folks who are immigrants, and my parents are, but I'm not. I guess I think this may get into another part of the discussion, but a lot of this comes down to language and how we are talking about these issues. And does that expand the coalition of folks who are caring about them, or does it contract them? And, on immigration, at least, when you ask somebody who identifies as progressive, politically progressive, where they rate immigration as kind of a priority, guess what that number is? I can't see everybody's face, but I'll say, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, right? Not 1, 2, or 3, unless Donald Trump is president. But any other time and point in time for somebody who identifies as progressive or liberal, there are so many other issues that people see that are more important than immigration. Now, when you ask somebody who identifies as politically conservative, where do they rate immigration? Over and over at number 1 or 2. So my point here is that those who, and I said this earlier, those who are against immigration and immigrants, they talk about it over and over and over and over again, really trying to ramp up the fear and the anxiety that a number of Americans feel. And when you take a step back, their language around invasion, around replacement, they're very apocalyptic messages. And then what we're saying on our side, if you will, on climate, is that we have our own apocalyptic message, right? Of the world is going to fail, it's going to end if we don't do this now. And I'm doing the things that you probably shouldn't do on a Zoom call where you can see anybody's face in a large audience and kind of thinking out loud. But you have 2 apocalyptic messages that are leading to 2 very powerful political forces in the country clashing. So that's probably not the kind of intersectionality, a term that I rarely use because I feel that, I won't go down that path, that we're expecting, right? But it's, we're creating polar opposites around 2 very different issues. And we're on this call today trying to think about, okay, how do we talk about them in the same way? And I guess my point here is that we've got to figure out a way to talk about them. And the reason I want to do this conversation is because of the sponsorship from the Faith Institute, the Interfaith Institute. It's because I think that a lot of folks in this country, they can wrestle with these questions around immigration, around climate change through their respective religious beliefs. So how do we find that? How do we thread that needle on these 2 issues? Otherwise, we have 2 apocalyptic narratives that are never going to allow for progress on either.
Thank you, Ali. And yeah, my apologies again for assuming that you were an immigrant. That's my bad. And so you actually stole the words out of my mouth for my next question, which was about, what is the unique role that religious and faith communities can play in this movement for ecological justice? And right before this, I listened to your podcast, one of the most recent ones, and it brought up the Kino Border Initiative in Nogales, Arizona, which is a place I actually had a chance to visit when I was in college. And I was very disturbed by some of the things I saw, but also hopeful that there were organizations that were, so to speak, answering the call of faith. And speaking about these narratives, apocalyptic narratives, is it possible that faith communities can be a place where we offer and foster different narratives about the challenges we face from climate change and climate-induced migration?
Yeah, Ali, I know you were kind of on a roll. I don't know if you wanted to go first. No, I got it. Okay, great. Yeah, so for me, this can feel like a hard question, but I can just say personally what I believe. I think that we are called to welcome the stranger, and I think we're also called to be stewards of the earth. And so I think when these two things come together, for me, it just makes sense. And a lot of it has to do with, again, having these conversations and listening to people's stories and trying to really see God in each and every person. And I'll tell you a quick story. When I was working on an urban farm in Nashville, I went to a Nazarene university in Nashville, and there I would often work with migrant workers. There was this one woman who I worked with, and she had escaped from Mexico, and it was a very violent situation. And I was plucking weeds with her, and she was a pastor, and also her husband they were pastors, and she was telling me about how they had ran away from a part in Mexico. It was Juarez, where there was no food for them, and then they came to Nashville, where there was also no food because of food deserts. And so to me, that really spoke to me. I said, how can this happen, where we have these folks who are within this tradition and who are right next to us, and we don't even know that they're hungry and they're starving, but are having these issues. And so really just having people come to the table and making room and being radically hospitable, I think is how I feel about your question personally.
Yeah, I think you put it really, really, really well there, Tabitha. Or I would say about in 2011, as an organization, we started doing a lot of work with the faith community, particularly the evangelical community. And we partnered with an organization called World Relief, which is one of the largest refugee resettlement organizations in the States, and also globally, I should say. And we partnered with them to launch an effort that's come to be known as Women of Welcome. And this is a community of well over 100,000 evangelical women who identify as politically conservative or moderate. And what we found is that by creating spaces, by creating spaces where they can relate to each other and through their faith and their personal experience, they can begin conversations around immigration. So we've done delegation trips to Oaxaca, to El Paso, to Laredo, and in each one of these trips, what happens is that women are seeing things for their firsthand. They're sharing those stories, and then they're together through their own churches, through Bible studies online, they're turning to their respective faith and then asking the question of, okay, what does it really mean to welcome the stranger? And for us as an organization, we don't identify as a faith-based organization, but we just know that if we are going to expand the coalition of Americans who care about immigrants, who care about compassionate solutions, we have to learn from them in terms of what their fears are, what their anxieties are when it comes to immigration, and then create ways to have these conversations. And kind of our informal motto as an organization is to meet people where they are, but not leave them there. And sometimes that can lead to some pretty awkward conversations. But I think overall, everybody is a better person on the other end, because we learn something about each other and then working together towards advancing change in the immigration space. And I'm increasingly interested in kind of how this sort of a strategy can be implemented in the context of climate change, and then how do you kind of start connecting dots between the two.
Great, thank you both. We'll now move into our audience question portion of the webinar. So I invite Terry back on for the first question.
I am back, and so Lori Chadwick wanted to know, how do we get politicians to do something about these issues, and what can we do? So that's a big question.
I think I was mentioning earlier about just being in dialogue with local officials. I think it's easier sometimes to have these local conversations than the international ones. And this is just in my experience in New Haven and also in Florida. I can't speak for other regions, but I really think that's one way to do it with politicians. And I was mentioning about local zoning boards, right? Sometimes what happens, I was listening to Ali talk about immigrants who had been moving from one kind of like environmentally degraded area to another, right? So like, for instance, for New Orleans. And sometimes those people are doubly displaced. And so asking your politicians and your local governments about like what are their plans for climate adaptation, right? Because most likely wherever you are, people who are marginalized will be further marginalized right where you live. So I think it's important to really start local and having those conversations.
Ali, okay, yeah, go ahead. Oh, I just wanted to see if you wanted to answer that question as well.
No, I think she did a great job. Sorry, my mute button was being very, very grumpy.
Well, it's funny, Tabitha, that you actually mentioned that, because I'm actually on the Planning and Zoning Commission of my town, and I ran for it because one of the things we were talking about is, affordable housing, and how I live in this very small rural town in Connecticut. And part of the reason I had the idea for this webinar was another webinar that we did in October on environmental racism, and Reverend Durley talked about the massive migration that Ali mentioned earlier from New Orleans to other cities, including Atlanta. And basically in the space of a week, 250,000 people moved to Atlanta with nothing. And what does that look like in terms of public school and health and, giving people support? So, yeah, I decided to try and get out in front of that on the planning and zoning in my tiny little town. Eamon, did you want to take the next question?
Sure, yeah. So Kiku is asking, immigration is often scapegoated as partially explaining people's sense of economic precarity in the US. Do you have any strategies for acknowledging these anxieties while taking the target off the backs of the immigrant community?
Yeah, that's a really tough one, because this is why we do so much work with the faith community, because everybody always has their own data or their own experience when it comes to economics. Our approach on this is twofold. One is we really try to identify who are the local business leaders who can kind of be a part of that conversation? Because I mean, look, as a Washington, D.C. based immigration advocate, I'm the least effective spokesperson or kind of person to persuade somebody at a very local level to talk about, the economic need for immigration. So that's why we often work with, the local business owner, the local chamber of commerce, or others to really be able to speak into the need for immigrants at a very, very, very local level. The other piece, and we're starting to see a little bit more success on this, and I think it's going to be a long arc, but actually 1 year ago to today, we published a report called Room to Grow. And it was for the first time, we had looked at the demographic decline of the US in the context of immigration. And what we found is that in order to maintain the current ratio of retirement age adults to working age adults, which is about 3.54, we need to increase immigration by 37%, which is roughly about 370,000 people. And in the grand scheme of things, that's not a lot of people. And our goal with that was to begin to develop a case that we could make to somebody who is on the verge of retirement, to be able to say to them, okay, you're 55 years old now. You want to retire in 10 years? This is where our social security system is going to be. This is where our economy is going to be on the current trajectory. We are not going to have enough working age adults to retirees. So it was the right message to articulate at a national level. And now we're trying to think about, okay, how do you do that, locally, and do that in a way to address that anxiety around retirement, and have a conversation about the way that immigration can help.
So the next, Doris asked, in your experience, which have been the best ways or events to bring people together and create a dialogue about climate change and migration within our local communities?
I've done some of this. I mean, this is a really good example. This right now, this panel, right? Iris we had one similar like this too. And there's so many documentaries that are out there, and maybe in reading and books. Perhaps you could do a what's it called when you have a book club? Have a book club.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
and have a conversation around that, or documentaries. Perhaps I'll send to Terry a couple of different resources that folks might be interested in using. There's some really cool theological books also. So it just kind of depends, personal stories or theology, depending on what it is that you want to do. So I'll be sure to send some of that along, but just really more things like this.
And I would say more things like this, and when we could do them in person, that they're taking place within the physical confines of a faith institution. I think that, and doing it in an interfaith way, it just, again, it's a space that, takes a little bit of the fire out.
Mm.
Great. And so continuing on the spiritual religious theme, Christine asks, do you have suggestions for how to raise consciousness in large numbers of people, as both climate change and migration are in some ways issues of how we relate to one another, and how much empathy we can have for other people. So Christine notes that in Baha'i teachings, that the earth is but one country and mankind its citizens. So what are ways that we can work to raise consciousness?
You're gonna make me take this one first. You're giving me like the very poker stare there. So I would say that at a national level or even a regional level, the power of the media is really important. And from our perspective, kind of given that one of our audiences that we want to reach are conservative and moderate people of faith, I don't really care if our name shows up in the New York Times, right? Our funders are happy. The people to our progressive left are thrilled. but it's not reaching the audience that we need to reach. So we spend a lot of time trying to understand what are the conservative publications, the religious publications that care about immigrants, that care about immigration, or at least are willing to have this conversation. So then the question I think we have to ask ourselves is that in those publications, in those kind of media bubbles, because we all have our own media bubble, are there trusted voices who, a conversation could be had about climate migration, and that over time they develop a comfort, they develop a desire to speak into these issues, and that's not going to happen overnight. But I mean, otherwise, we just run the risk of always talking to ourselves. And it means that some of those first articles or first quotes are going to be, they may not be exactly what we would like to see as advocates for a more constructive approach to climate migration. But over time, just like I said earlier, we're going to meet somebody where they are. We're just not going to leave them there. But it comes down to who the right messenger is, what the right message is to the audience that we need to reach.
I had something quick to add to that. Thanks, Ali. Sorry, I put you on the spot there. That's a really hard question. It really is. And, I think some of what I was talking about during my presentation was some, kind of like how race intersects with climate migration. And I think one of the things that we have to be really careful about too is how we portray folks who are going through these issues, right? So that we're also showing a lens of empowerment too, and not just suffering. And so for folks who are wanting to kind of bring more awareness of these issues to your community, I would really just, I would say to please also consider that, so that if you're looking through the issue of an empowerment lens.
Kehinde earlier sort of was saying that there were more reasons for migration than just climate change. And I was really interested in what Ali had to say about how climate change and the drug cartels intersected on migration. And so what I was wondering is if either one of you had thoughts on how government corruption intersects with climate change and how that drives corruption.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, I think that right now there are 3, if not 4 drivers of migration, particularly from Central America: poverty, violence, corruption, and climate change. All 4 of those things kind of connect, wind together. And again, kind of without any sort of legal pathway to reach the United States, the person is faced with this very difficult decision: do they stay or do they pay the cartels to get them out? So that's the way, I guess, the most simple way I could boil this down. So the question is, let's say, the 2 hurricanes that hit Honduras in 2019 that led to, a spike in kind of numbers of folks leaving the northern part of the country. The U.S. did not, the U.S. was very hesitant to kind of provide direct aid to Hondurans through the Honduran government. So there's always kind of this these relationships with a non-governmental organization or civil society in countries, so that they are the ones who are receiving the funds, and that's in essence a way to at least get around the corruption of these government institutions. Which, okay, that's great, but is it sustainable? Does it actually address the long-term problem of rooting out corruption? So again, in Honduras, and I think it was 2014, there was a terrible murder by the Honduran National Police that was kind of discovered after a number of years. To make a long story short, I apologize. The U.S. government and others politically and financially supported an effort within Honduras to kind of purge the Honduran National Police. That was all supported by the president of Honduras at the time. Over a course of, I want to say less than 2 years, you saw, I want to say a good 30%, 35% of the Honduran police be fired, from top commanders to rank and file. At the same time, you saw the homicide rate in the nation cut in half. So there was a real life impact of rooting out corruption within the national police, a real quality of life impact, if you will, to see that sort of a drop in homicide. And remember, I mean, just as recently as 2013, 2014, Honduras was one of the most violent countries in the world. So that, from our perspective, is a way that corruption can be addressed, quality of life improved, and the confidence that Hondurans then have in the nation and make the decision to say, you know what, I'm going to stay and I'm going to make a go of it. Because at the end of the day, very few of us want to leave our homes, but for one reason or another, we have to.
Yeah, that was actually really why I called it "Why Do People Leave the Homes They Love?" Because I felt like a lot of times when we're talking in the about immigration and climate change in this country, we're thinking about immigration from sort of a very white American lens of thinking like, of course people want to come here. Look at our great country, and sort of not really understanding that the homes that people came from are places that they love with cultures and foods and landscapes and mountains and stuff that make their hearts sing. And so what must it be like for those people to feel like they have to go away? So that was really kind of part of the inspiration for this. Eamon, do you have any other questions? Are there any more questions in the chat? Oh, wait, someone just popped something.
We don't have any. Oh, wait, Phoebe just came in with a question. Great. Phoebe's my advisor in my grad program, so she came to my rescue. Thank you, Phoebe. So Phoebe asks, are there examples from other countries of good policy in regards to climate migrants and climate migration?
Ooh, so that's a really big question, and I think it's because there are many facets, right? I guess when I hear that question, I think about climate adaptation, and then I think about kind of like the after effect of actual climate migration. In my opinion, I think that the best type of environmental migration policy is preventative, right? And so there are some really cool, I saw some fellow FES, Yale School of the Environment folks in the chat, but you know, there are a lot of these strategies of using of natural barriers to prevent things, you know, like storm surges, like I was talking about mangrove trees and seagrasses and things like that. I think it's so important to put funding towards preventative measures. And I feel like there are a lot of places in the Caribbean who are doing this work. I think of places like Barbados and Trinidad and Jamaica and Guyana to an extent, I think has some pretty cool policies of having natural barriers for climate mitigation. But really, I think there's this big pivoting towards climate adaptation, right? Whereas we have to admit and say, okay, these things are happening. There was a report recently that said that there's still time to reverse temperatures rising, but sea level is inevitable. And so we have to pivot to those adaptation strategies. And so I really think that those interventions are extremely important. I can't really think of any countries that have a good sort of like resettlement program. You know, maybe I can think of Australia or New Zealand, but only because they're forced to do so because of legal ramifications by the United Nations saying that you cannot deport people because they literally cannot go back to their homes because it's underwater. But I'm a really firm believer of preventative measures.
Let's see here. I want to, a couple people have said that some of the events like this only attract the people that are already in agreement. And I wanted to just drop a book recommendation by Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, who just is a climate scientist. She's an evangelical Christian, and she's just released a book called, I believe, Saving Us. And we actually had her as part of our first webinar with Hartford International University. And one of the things that stuck out to me was that she said, out of all the people, in America that you could talk to, 7% of people are what she calls dismissives. They cannot be reached on climate change. They are not going to listen, no matter how many moral, scientific, ethical, economic cases you make for addressing climate change. They're just not going to listen. But the other 93% are somewhere between absolutely being on board and skeptical but willing to listen. And so her strategy, Susan just put it in the chat, her strategy is to just keep talking to as many people as you can. And I think she recommends more small groups. I know it's much more appealing for us to reach as large a group as we possibly can every time, but sometimes that's not the most effective way to communicate this. So if you're feeling like, you're having trouble reaching people, just keep talking. And for those 7% that are just dismissive, Dr. Hayhoe says, just don't spend your time on them. They're not going to listen. It's just the 7%. The other 93% can be reached, and so so just for that, I recommend the book. I'm looking forward to Ali's book coming out. So I'm really glad that we were all able to be here. There might be another question in the chat.
There's one more question from
Sure.
another college advisor of mine from Montana. So Lori Pengelly Drake asks, what are your opinions of the preventative work the Biden administration is doing, led by Kamala Harris?
Getting the poker look again from Tabitha. So I assume that the question is about the root causes work that the vice president has led. I mean, I think that has gone really, really well. I mean, look, the vice president has been dealt some of the toughest cards on the kind of administration's kind of agenda, and migration from Central America is pretty high ranking in terms of tough cards to be dealt. Over the last 6 months, I don't have the notes right in front of me. You've seen a private sector investment in Central America, both in terms of technology, resources, kind of job creation. That's really important. Early on in the process, you saw you had to look carefully for them, but you saw, I think, important changes by Department of Justice and other enforcement mechanisms within the US government to look at and root out corruption that's coming from Central America. There's constant conversations, whether it's DHS or other agencies with both Mexico and Central American countries, to look at what the cartels are doing and to really try to disrupt what the cartels have been doing. And then there's been investment by USAID in the civil society sector across Central America in terms of addressing corruption, poverty, violence, all these being root causes of migration. But ultimately, I think one of the most important ways that we can really address unauthorized migration from Central America is to actually create authorized ways for people to immigrate to the U.S. and that are authorized. In essence, legal immigration, and that ultimately, requires Congress to get its act together and pass some laws. And to pick up on what Terry is saying, Congress is not going to act on immigration if it's the left versus the right all the time. We've got to figure out ways that we're actually talking to those folks in the middle and helping them see that smart reforms to the immigration system address their concerns.
I had one comment to add to that too. I haven't been following as closely the past few months of what's been happening with the vice president, but I will say that this is the first administration that has actually acknowledged climate migration, and so I think that has to count for something. I also see something in the chat about Australia being the last place for a model, and I agree. I totally agree. I was being sarcastic that, yeah. But and Terry, that book you were talking about, I think that the Yale Center for Climate Communications, they also have a lot of different models that show that it's always like this kind of middle section of people who are not sure, right? That's the largest majority of people. And so just having those conversations over and over again, I think it's a really good strategy.
Thank you. And that's actually a really good segue in that part of the reason we wanted to offer Spanish interpretation was that we realized we're not reaching a whole segment of our population that prefers Spanish as their primary language. And so I think a part of it is also being willing and excited about reaching new communities as where they are in ways that resonate the most with them. So I just want to, I think we've sort of come to the end of our questions. I want to thank our panelists so much for being with us tonight. And I want to thank our moderator for leading our conversation. And Steve, if you could put up the slides for our upcoming events. So IREJN, speaking of what can you do, we have a webinar coming up in just a few weeks on how to be an effective advocate. And it will be another virtual event. We'll be talking about environmental legislation in Connecticut, as well as how to communicate effectively with legislators, track bills, and more. We found that a lot of the people that get very involved in legislative issues kind of understand this, but there's a huge swath in the middle that cares, wants to get involved, but doesn't know how. So this event will be perfect for those people that really want to know more about how they can have an impact especially in our Connecticut State legislative session. Again, it's going to be free. It's Thursday evening. And we will also be learning about the legislative issues that will be up in the session by that point. So that is one coming up. We are also doing an event on the Jewish Shemitah, the year of Shemitah, called Relief for Our Land, Our Neighbors, and Ourselves. We'll be looking at what that means. And then there are a few other events also coming up, a Climate Justice March, which is next Tuesday at 2 in Hartford. There is a wonderful book talk in New Haven on February 16th. And of course, the Earth Day Climate Strike, led by our Sunrise Movement, on Friday, April 22nd. So all of these events I will send out along with our video from tonight, the recording. You can share, you can watch it again, take notes. Thank you so much to Hartford International University for co-hosting this with us. And thank you all for joining us for this important topic.